Having this guy on the show at this point in the calendar means we've officially turned the page, and we are in the early stages of draft season. Dane and I were talking while I was in New Orleans, just chopping it up about some stuff, and he's like, my top 100 comes out on Tuesday if we wanted to do a show about that. And I was like, you know what? It's exactly what I want to do this week. So here he is, the man himself, Dane Brugler, kicking off draft season in the right way. Dane, how you feeling? We're post Super Bowl. Now it's your world now.
I loved the coverage from New Orleans. You guys did such an awesome job, crushed it. Have you been fasting since you got home from New Orleans?
So the answer to that is no. Whenever I get home, even if I've eaten like absolute garbage for the last like 10 days, whenever I get home from a trip, I always just kind of like am a piece of shit that night. Like I'll order junk food and I'll just like sit on the couch and eat garbage with my wife. So that's exactly what I did last night. Today it starts. I might not consume like human food today. There's a chance I just go the whole day without it. It's just water and coffee,
Water.
and then I'll just start my life tomorrow. We're on track to that. It's 12:40 p.m. I have not put any sort of food in my body, and there's a chance I just don't.
The Robert Mays diet. I love it.
It's all or nothing, man. That's all I got. When you're going as hard as I was last week, you have to offset it somewhere along the way. Unfortunately, I have a wedding that I have to fit into a suit for in like 4 days, which when my wife told me that we had a family wedding the weekend after the Super Bowl, I was like, all right, well, this is going to be a gauntlet. I'm not sure how this is going to go.
Oof, that's 4 days. Good luck.
Yeah, and then we have a week in Indy in like 2 weeks. So the off season no longer exists, really. We're back in Indianapolis essentially right after the Super Bowl, but I'm excited to get the draft conversations kicked off. You did that in a big way this week. You dropping your real kind of off season top 100. The last one you did was just a big board in November, right? This is your first top 100 overall.
Yeah, I mean, I've done 2 top 50s. I did one in August,
Yes.
kind of kick off the season, and then one just after Halloween, kind of like a mid-season check-in. This is what we're looking at. But yeah, this is the first top 100 since we know the underclassmen that have declared. We have the All-Star season, Shrine Bowl, Hula Bowl, Senior Bowl, all in the rearview mirror. This is the gear up to the combine. And this is what teams are doing right now. All the scouts are back in their respective cities for meetings every single day where they are going through and building a preliminary board where they take guys and throw them in the trash can, not going to be considered for us, and they'll put guys on the board and they kind of figure it out to get a baseline for going into the combine. So there's some level of expectations about what they're looking at, the players that they want to hone in on, and that's kind of what this top 100 is trying to. There will be plenty of fluctuation as we go through, especially after the combine, some of the testing. But this is maybe a little bit of, all right, let's get them in the right neighborhood. We'll keep moving these guys as we get closer, but trying to boil it down to get a good idea of how NFL teams see these guys and where the evaluations are currently going into the combine.
Have you ever thought about what your entrance music would be? Like your at bat walk up music, or like if you were a wrestler, what your music would be?
No, I honestly can say I've never thought of that. Do you have any suggestions?
I'm just curious what it is because I want us to put together like some sort of video or some sort of graphic where like we drop the music and like somebody photoshops your face onto Stone Cold Steve Austin, and that's just how we start draft season every single year. Like,
The
oh,
glass
it's Dane
break,
Brugler's
right?
music.
The glass break is so good that I would hate to copy something, but you hear that glass break and the Stone Cold, that'd be awesome.
We might just have to do that because
Yeah.
we have to some way we have to celebrate us getting to this point in the year, and you just getting deep right away about like guys putting together their draft boards. This is exactly what I wanted out of this show.
Well, I
So
appreciate
let's
all the retweets and people. I mean, Ian Rappaport's retweeted it and said, "All right, now it begins." So it does kind of feel like that. Of all right, this is the starting point. Now let's race to April.
So I want to start kind of zoomed out a little bit because we're just wading into this. As you were going through your initial top 100 and you kind of took this bird's eye view of the class for the first time and put it on paper, what were your initial thoughts as you were going through this exercise? There were just some of your bigger picture takeaways about this class overall as we get started.
Yeah, and I don't think there was anything groundbreaking that we didn't already know. Tight end, running back, defensive line, those are the three positions that are just loaded Several of those guys at those positions, I had to leave off the top 100, and I hated doing it, especially D line. It's just such a loaded group, edge and defensive tackles. A lot of future starters are going to come from this draft. And going into the fourth round, there's still going to be plenty of names that are quality players. So those three positions certainly stand out. I think that when you look at the top of the draft, I feel really good about the top two guys just being, those are the blue chippers, talking about Travis Hunter from Colorado, Abdul Carter from Penn State. And then I agonized over who I was putting at three. Just I think that there's maybe a tier of 10 guys. But any of those 10, I think you could make a case for why they would belong at three. And, you hate to do it by position, or you like say, well, it's got to be a left tackle or it's got to be a pass rusher. You don't want to think about it necessarily in those terms. You just give me the best impact player. And I settled on Jalen Walker from Georgia, who is a big projection, but the traits are awesome. The character's awesome. There's just a lot that I would want to make that bet. So, just after those top two guys, ranking 3 through like 12 is really interesting, and it's going to be a wild difference from board to board. But I mean, I keep coming back to the quarterbacks, and this is something that, um, I'm trying to think of the best way to frame how to talk about this quarterback class. And I think that we'll have plenty of time to dissect each individual guy, but I kind of want to look at it through this lens. Since 2014, so like the last 11 drafts, only once has there been a draft where we had more day two quarterbacks drafted than day one. That was the Kenny Pickett year. One first round quarterback, and then a pretty rough group later on with Ritter and Malik Willis and Matt Corral.
And
It's
the
not going to be
EJ Manuel year was the other year that was a little bit wonky in there, right? Was that 2013?
yeah 20 that was 2013. So that was
Yeah.
right before. That's why I cut it off at 2014. That was EJ Manuel had no business going first round, but he did. And then Matt Barkley, Ryan Nassib was in that group. Yeah, a couple other names. But so just the last 11 drafts, just once. But when you look at this class, I think based on my evals, based off of how teams talk about these quarterbacks, I think there's a very good chance we have more day two quarterbacks than first round quarterbacks. And it's one of those things where teams are going to look at it and say, yeah, like let's get our tackle here. Let's take a chance on a pass rusher here in the first round, and then we'll take our swing on day two. And if it works out, great. But drafting a quarterback at pick 60 or pick 80, it's not going to stop us from drafting one next year or the year after that if it doesn't work out. And so I realize how unique the Eagles situation has been the last 5 years. But Jalen Hurts was basically a flyer in the second round
Yeah.
and outside the top 50 picks. So, and the Eagles were debating between him and another player up until the wire. So it's not like they, traded up and, really targeted him. Like it just kind of worked out that they drafted Jalen Hurts. And I'm not going to say that day two quarterbacks is now the norm. That's not it. The playoffs still chock full of first round guys. But in a class like this one, it is not going to be surprising when there's more day two quarterbacks drafted, especially when, okay, for example, I'm thinking about the Colts. If you're Ballard and you might feel like you have to go all in on this version of what you've built to keep your job. But I would argue that you look at one of these day two quarterbacks as a potential off ramp if Anthony Richardson and that trajectory, it just doesn't take shape by Halloween. The chances of threading a needle like the Eagles did with Hurts, it's unlikely, flat out, low percentage. But it's still a potential option that I think several teams are going to examine based off of what this draft is giving us. And so, the Rams have a unique situation with Stafford. I mean, there's going to be a lot of dominoes that fall these next few months before we get to the draft. And we'll get into more team specific discussions later and as we get closer. But thinking about what we can learn from the Eagles Super Bowl, and then with this draft specifically, it's just a unique year with these day two quarterbacks.
I think we can learn something from the Eagles and the Niners I would throw in there as well. A team that
Yeah.
their off ramp for quarterback ended up becoming a franchise altering thing. We talk less about what happened with Trey Lance because they landed on Brock Purdy. We talk less
Right.
about the Carson Wentz situation blowing up for the Eagles because they had an off ramp for Jalen Hurts. Just giving yourself multiple chances here. And I think that is worthwhile. The Colts are a good team to mention because they don't really have a ready made backup. They had
Mhm.
38-year-old Joe Flacco last year. So you could easily talk yourself into it and say, we need a backup quarterback anyway. If we take a guy in the 4th round, that's a worthwhile price for that roster spot. And then potentially, does it give us another solution? If you don't feel great about what's happening at your quarterback position, taking multiple bites at the apple over a series of several years is typically worthwhile. So I think a lot of teams could be thinking about it that way. You and I had this discussion after the Senior Bowl. We had this conversation. Some of it made it into the live stream we did last week from New Orleans. Some of it did not. So it's worth rehashing some of it here. As we look at the top of the draft, I think the biggest, most important conversation for me is how many quarterbacks are going to go is ultimately going to be driven by how many teams feel compelled to leave the top 10 with a quarterback. And that is going to be probably the most important question. And if you look at the teams at the top, Tennessee's fascinating to me because
Yep.
I would not be surprised if after last offseason, they overcorrected and just unraveled everything they did. We were super, super aggressive. Maybe let's pull back a little bit and understand what our timeline should be. Let's just try to get good players. We don't need a quarterback out of this draft. That approach would not surprise me. I think the Browns are super interesting, right? Do the
Yes.
Browns think this is our best chance in the top 5 to go get one? We're not going to be drafting this high again. Or are they so far in rebuild mode that they're not really thinking about it that way? I don't know how the Browns see themselves. And so
Mhm.
that to me is going to be one of the defining aspects of how we think about the top 5. The one team, we talked about this coming out of Mobile, and it's been kind of the murmurs about the entire draft process that does feel compelled to come out of this process with a quarterback is the Giants. So if
Yep.
we think the Giants are going to leave the top 5 with a quarterback come hell or high water because out of self-preservation, out of their team building timeline, everything, it aligns for them to do this. If there's only one team that's feeling that way, it's easy to talk yourself into a timeline where there's only one quarterback that goes in the first round. And I don't really know how many other teams we can say that about. Like you could say that about the Raiders, but this is a team that's now in year 1 of a new regime. Do they feel like they have to come out of this draft with a quarterback? I'd be surprised if they felt that way. And I don't know what other teams would fit that billing. So if it really just is the Giants, do we just get Cam Ward in the top 5 and then we have to wait a long time before the second one comes off the board? That wouldn't surprise me just based on the league and what it feels and that it needs right now.
And that's a big part of this. Another big part of it is ownership. Again, ownership is as much a driver of teams drafting quarterbacks early as anything. And so sometimes it's a mandate from ownership. Hey, we have to upgrade the quarterback position. I need to know how we're going to do that. And they're not going to want to hear, enter free agent B as the answer. And so for some teams, it will be okay. Well, we could go Shador Sanders at 7, if you're the Jets. But, is that really how a lot of teams want to attack this draft? And I don't think it is. And I think we also have to, I could know how every single area scout feels about these quarterbacks. But once the coaches and the play callers get involved in the process, it really changes everything. An area scout could have a second round grade on a quarterback, but it doesn't mean much if the coaches don't connect with that player during interviews and board work and all of the steps of the process. So, for bad organizations, it might not matter. I always think back to the 2019 class. Jay Gruden wanted, I believe, Darnell Savage in Washington. He didn't want Dwayne Haskins, but Dan Snyder did. And so that was the pick in the first round. And, when you don't have a connect between the coaches in the front office, obviously it's doomed from the start. For most smart organizations, I think the coaching staff, how they feel about the quarterbacks, it directly influences how you stack them on the board and then ultimately whether or not you draft him. And so, looking at this class specifically, I don't think a ton has changed since Halloween, based on what we thought. Cam Ward is most
Where
likely going to
you
be that.
have them is so telling to me. The fact that all
Yeah,
these other guys ping-ponged up and down, and you were just like, "Nah, the quarterbacks are what they are. I'm not doing
they
this."
are.
You had them in almost exact same spot in your rankings.
Very, very much so. And I think you can, like, if you had a bet on one of these guys, I understand the Cam Ward bet because of just the way he's gotten better every year. There's a real explosive nature to the way he plays. He's he walks a fine line of being loose, but not reckless all the times, but sometimes he is. He is a tough evaluation because he's going to need some time to continue developing. He is far from a finished product. And then Shador, I think he can start in the league. It's just more of what's the upside here? What is the ceiling of him? Can he really truly elevate an offense regardless of what's around him? And a lot of teams struggle with that, answering that question. I think something interesting is going to be quarterback 3. When it's all said and done, do we have a third quarterback being talked about as a possibility? And every year, this happens every year. 2 years ago, people were talking about Hendon Hooker going top 25. There were mock drafts. I can't remember who. I won't call them out, but there were some people that had Hendon Hooker in the top 10. Like, it's just not. We get. I don't know if people just get bored and they want to just throw quarterback options in there. And you know what? Sometimes it actually
It's
does
always the
happen.
mock like a week before the draft that somebody's doing something crazy like that. Remember the Malik Willis at number 2, buzz and like the 5 days before the draft? It
The
always
Malik,
happens because we've been staring at it for way too long.
the Malik Wars. We fought those battles long ago. But even think of last year with Bo Nix. Like, that's an example of it. Like, a lot of people thought in the league and out the league, he wasn't going to go top 20. He would go somewhere between 21 and 40, late 1, early 2. And he goes 12. And, we all look at it as a reach. And hey, it turns out Sean Payton knows what he's doing. And so where these guys end up is a big factor. But sometimes the buzz about another quarterback getting in there, it actually happens. This year, I think the buzzy name is Jackson Dart from Ole Miss, who the timing of this buzz is kind of strange. It's on the heels of the Senior Bowl where he was very average down in Mobile. I think he got better every day, but if you knew nothing about him going into the week, you didn't leave the week saying, oh yeah, that's an obvious top 50 type of player. And so my theory with Dart is he might get that Bo Nix bump where Nix wasn't supposed to be the guy, to lead his team to the playoffs as a rookie. Everyone's kind of looking for that next Bo Nix. And when you look at Dart, I can understand how some people, if you squint, you might be able to get there and make that comparison. Good size athlete, 6'2", 226 pounds, highly productive in the SEC, very willing to push the ball downfield. He led the FBS in yards per completion this past year, about 10.8. The character, the competitiveness are outstanding. And that's the type of thing that evaluators can really latch onto during the process. I don't think he has the same arm talent as Nix, and he's not as NFL ready as Nix was. Now, I think there's a spot on day 2 where I would probably roll the dice on Dart because they're starting upside there. It's hard to make a bet like that in the first round, especially coming from an Ole Miss offense where he wasn't asked to make whole field reads consistently. It's a lot of one read, one side of the field, drop the eyes, scramble. He benefited from a lot of play action. It was, I think, over 53%, second most in all of college football last year. So with Dart, it's not that he can't do what an NFL team is going to ask him to do. It's more of he's unproven in a lot of those areas. And I'm not going to say it's impossible for him to go in the first round. All it takes is one rogue team to push all the chips in. And but I am surprised that some people are talking about him like it'd be easy to make that bet on a guy who he needs a lot of developing.
If you look at how the 6 quarterbacks came off the board last year, and you think about the teams that, again, talking about their urgency to find one, Minnesota needed one, right? Minnesota needed one based on the other decisions that they had made. Check. You mentioned the coaching staff getting involved. I think that's exactly what happened in Atlanta, where
Yes.
they signed Kirk Cousins, and then the coaches got involved. The coaches loved Penix. They saw Staffordish stuff, and now we have an urgency to get this guy because we have the 8th overall pick. And then with Nix, same kind of deal. Like, I think Sean Payton wanted a quarterback out of that draft so they could just kind of get things kickstarted. So until you can read some of the tea leaves and guess about which teams are in those sorts of positions. Obviously, the Vikings made it very obvious with the trades that they made. We all knew that that's the direction they probably needed to go. Maybe some of those breadcrumbs will be left for us in the next couple months, where we'll start to get an understanding of like, okay, the Jets really do need a quarterback based on X, Y, and Z reasons. I just think at this stage of the proceedings, we're so early that it's hard to know what that handful of teams is going to be that maybe has more interest in coming away with this draft with one than we think right now.
And I think you're right to think that way because, the situation with Stafford and LA, that's going
It's a
to
perfect
impact
example.
what teams do. You think of the Steelers. They're at a crossroads right now at their quarterback position, and it's how are they going to attack it this offseason? I'm sure they have, maybe a priority list of option A through option F. And where does drafting a quarterback in the first round appear on that list? Is it C or is it down at the bottom and it's their last option available? So it's a really interesting year, and it's still pretty early to know exactly the teams that might be a little more aggressive than others, aside from probably the Giants. But it's also just such a unique year to have the conversation because of the nature of these quarterbacks and the fact that I think there will be more day 2 picks. It's a more interesting quarterback class on day 2 than it is day 1. And that's something that I don't think I've ever said before. Those words have never come out of my mouth. So it's really, and I'll just run through the rest of the quarterbacks that appeared in my top 100.
I'm curious who you
Dart
think is the
was
most interesting among this group. They two guys, like who do you have circled as the most intriguing option?
To me, it's Tyler Shuck at Louisville, and I received plenty of raised eyebrows when he came in as a top 60 guy for me in my top 100. But I promise you, there's going to be, based on how I know teams feel about him, there's going to be more and more buzz. Since my top 100 came out, I've already been tagged in a lot more appreciation tweets about Shuck than the last 6 months. I think people are blinded with him by two things. He's 25 years old, and injuries derailed his college career as a seventh-year senior. Two things that are not ideal. But I think, first of all, with the age, I think people are too obsessed with the age. We're talking about somebody outside the top 50 picks. Who cares if he's not 21?
Also, he's not an edge rusher. This isn't a
Exactly.
window or a
Yes.
running back. I think with quarterbacks, we're starting to learn our lesson a little bit that
It's very
that
unique.
extra that extra time to marinate, I think, has
Mhm.
been a positive for some of these
Yes.
guys over the last couple of years and not a negative. You have to trace why they were in college that long, and not
Yes.
every case is the same. But Bo Nix and Jaden Daniels having the experiences they had in college, I think undeniably was a factor in their favor coming into their rookie years. And I think that bared out.
There's no doubt. There's no doubt. The common thread between Daniels and Nix, there were 5-year starters. We've talked about it before. If Jaden Daniels went to the NFL after his junior year, he's a fifth-round pick at best. So the ability to work through a lot of that stuff personally and on the field, in just terms of maturation, that is, and teams look at that as a positive. The fact that he is an older guy, and you have a better idea of what you're getting. Now, the medicals have to come back clean. That's something that could change his grade, but he stayed healthy all of this season, which is certainly a positive, or a reason to be optimistic about him moving forward. He's one of the best pure throwers of the football in this class. The ball explodes off his hand. He's got some mobility to him. Sometimes he is late to see things, but again, we're talking about someone outside the top 50 picks. So Dart, I think, was at 57. Shuck was at 59. Jalen Milroe was next. He's such a wild card, phenomenal athlete. He'll light up the combine if he tests at 220 pounds. Just so raw as a passer. The Senior Bowl is rough. You could tell he was trying to work through a lot of different things mechanically, and that really affected his timing, his accuracy. The athletic profile is awesome, and the person is awesome. He's a really smart guy, awesome guy. It makes it easier to make a bet on him when you have the athletic profile and you have the type of person he is. But it's a long term type of developmental plan for him, and there's
What
only going
what
to
are
be
we talking about with him versus like a Hurts coming out in terms of how
that's the
refined they are in
comparison.
terms of bet?
Yes,
Is that comparison apt? I'm not just like helmet scouting here. Like you think that's actually the
that's the
argument you
comparison.
can talk yourself into?
That's if you are thinking about it in the most optimistic light, you are saying, okay, I am, because Jalen Hurts had more success in college. I mean, he led Oklahoma to college football playoffs that year. Talking about Heisman Trophy. I mean, he had a lot more success at the college level, but in just terms of pure skill set, Jalen Milroe is further, he's not on the same level as a passer, but he is a much better athlete. I mean, Jalen Hurts is, at his best, at his peak, was running in the mid 4.6s maybe. Now he's not even at that level, where Jalen Milroe should run in the low 4.4s, if not get into the 4.3s at 220 pounds. The arm is NFL quality in terms of velocity. Now it's just a matter of repeatable consistency with the mechanics, the accuracy, the touch. And you see it in flashes. And if you really grade to the flashes, you can justify drafting him on day 2 and saying, this is a long-term development, but we think, where he could be down the line is something that could be, a worthy bet at this point. And, absolute worst case scenario, move him to running back if you have to give up on the plan after 2 years, because he is such a ridiculous athlete. So it just, there's only so many teams that are going to be willing to make a bet like that. And so that just diminishes the landing spots for him and makes it tough to project. But he's a top 100 guy. It's just a matter of where he goes. And then after
It's funny
him,
for
it
me,
was
there aren't that many guys, there aren't that many teams in the NFL. If we had this conversation 5 years ago, think
right.
about how many teams a player like that could make sense for because they had a 37, 38-year-old quarterback. All
Hmm.
those guys are gone. Like, the only real teams that have 37, 38-year-old starting quarterbacks now, the Rams, the Jets. The Jets, we know they're getting rid of that guy. The Rams may get rid of their guy, so they may need an immediate answer. The team that comes to mind for me, and again, I have no idea what they think of him, even like scheme fit with what they're trying to do this year. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm talking purely timeline, would be like Seattle.
That's,
Right?
yeah.
If you wanna
Hmm.
roll with Geno for, like, 2 more years, you wanna have this guy sit, you develop him, you make a bet on what the 2, 3-year projection can be, that would make sense to me just based on what they have currently on the roster, but there aren't that many teams currently in that position, especially when you compare it
Yes.
to what the landscape looked like a few years ago.
I'll be surprised if Seattle comes out of this draft without a quarterback. I will,
They should take one.
because
I love
yes,
Geno. They should take a quarterback at some point.
and exactly what we've been talking about. You draft a guy in the 3rd or 4th round, and who knows, it might hit. It might be Seattle's next Russell Wilson. And it doesn't need to be from day 1, obviously, with Geno still there. Maybe not even in year 2. We'll see how that plays out. But that's the type of bet that you make in a class like this. Will Howard also made a top 100. I think he's more of a career backup. I mean, he finished the season so strong, winning the national championship at Ohio State. The progress that he made was really promising. He's a really competitive, smart kid. Physical tools are there. Probably more of a backup profile. So, I mean, those are 6 quarterbacks that cracked the top 100. But there were even a few more that just missed that I know some teams really like. Kyle McCord from Syracuse, strictly a pocket passer, but he anticipates well. He gets the ball out. He does a lot of NFL things pretty well. Quinn Ewers from Texas, he's another guy that just plays with poise. There's things I like about him. The durability questions that might hurt him a little bit, but wouldn't shock me if he ends up in the top 100 picks.
Why do you
And
think
I
he didn't come back to school or didn't try to, like, refresh himself somewhere else after this year? Have you talked to anybody about that?
It was just a mindset from the start. Like, this is my last year. Like, he was
Okay.
ready. Obviously, with the situation in Texas is a little unique because of with Arch Manning kind of waiting in the wings. Like, that specific situation was so unique. And then, I mean, he had several teams calling him. Miami did not take Carson Beck as a transfer until they checked in with Quinn Ewers. So there were several teams that were throwing around some big money. And I mean, Quinn Ewers is already a millionaire. He was a millionaire before he took his first college snap with all the NIL money that he had coming in. He was ready coming into this year, kind of saying, this is my 4th year in college. This will be my last year. And so he's an interesting one because I think he'll impress when he sits down with teams and they get a chance to interview him and understand how he thinks and how he sees the field. The thing that bothers some teams is just he's missed multiple games every single year, and while I think I commend him for being at the toughness that he shows, playing through a lot of these injuries, especially an ankle injury late in the year. You have to be. I mean, all quarterbacks are banged up. That's just part of the job description in the NFL. And if you can't play at a high level when you're banged up, it's not going to work. And so teams are going to look at Ewers a little bit differently. He's going to be a really interesting one. And one other quarterback I wanted to throw out there too is Dylan Gabriel, who has some fans across the league because in terms of the interview process, he's been the most impressive. He's undersized. The ball does it dies. I mean, he's good in the short to intermediate game. It'll die deep. But he's in terms of the mind, the character, he's got some fans across the league. And so I think those 9 quarterbacks, they're all going to go in the top 4 rounds. And it's going to be really interesting how early some of these teams maybe, pull the trigger based off of, not wanting to miss out on their guy.
And who does it and why? I think is going to be one
Yeah.
of the things worth paying attention to. Like the Colts are a great team to bring up. If they take a guy in the 3rd round, it's like, oh, okay.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
you're just telling us what you think about how this season is going to potentially go. So the messages that teams send about their long-term plans based on their quarterback plan in this draft is absolutely going to be a fun thing
But
that's worth
just
paying
smart,
attention
right?
to.
Like
Sure.
the Browns are another, like you mentioned the Browns and all the different ways they could go. If you don't love one of these quarterbacks, with the whole Myles Garrett situation, I've heard a lot of people saying how, oh, well, this might change, how they look at the second overall pick, and of course, it doesn't.
It
Whether Myles
shouldn't.
Garrett is on this team or not, if you love a quarterback at 2, you take him, plain and simple. If you don't draft one. But drafting a quarterback, if you're the Browns, it still makes sense to draft a quarterback on day 2. And like a Tyler Shuck, for example, he's ready to go. I mean, he's not going. He's going to compete for the starting job in camp. And if he has a promising rookie year, gets better and better, we don't have to force the issue next year and overdraft a quarterback if there's not one there for us. And so the Colts, it wouldn't be an indictment of Anthony Richardson necessarily. It's just it's about being smart with your team building and creating insurance. If you're not going to buy a brand new house and then not have insurance for it. Like, if you having an insurance plan in case plan A doesn't work out is just smart business. And so why teams don't do more of that on day 2. But I think looking at the Eagles situation and seeing how they handled the Carson Wentz situation, again, very unique, but still having that insurance, I think is just smart business.
I think when you look at what the Texans did a couple years ago, and we talk about ownership and we talk about pressure, talk about outside forces, all that stuff matters. The fact that the Texans kind of got to operate in complete anonymity for like 2 full seasons allowed them to do the Davis Mills thing. But if you can do that, if that's where the urgency of your owner is, if that's the sort of methodical plan that you can see through as a team builder, there's not a lot of downside to that. Like if we can just kind of take a guy in the 3rd or 4th round, he can start, we can see what he is because we know we're not going anywhere anyway. That sort of patience is probably the right approach in a lot of situations that not enough teams take because they're trying to speed themselves up unnecessarily. So I
Yeah.
think how a lot of teams approach it and whether we see something like that, if you're the Jets, for example, right? The Jets is a very different market than Houston. There's very different outside forces. But if you do something like that because you kind of know where you are in your timeline, is that actually the better way to approach the position when you're thinking about a 2, 3, 4 year plan than forcing the issue at 7 when there isn't a guy that you like there?
Yeah. And obviously the track record of day 2 quarterbacks isn't great, but I think we're in a place in
But
the
the
NFL.
downside, the risk
Exactly.
reward is in your
That's
favor.
exactly. We're in a place in the NFL where I think teams are more open to thinking in those terms, where it's about placing smart bets, and
Yeah.
that's how the Eagles were built. Placing a lot of smart bets. Even some bets didn't work out. Okay, let's place more smart bets. And at the end of the day, if you place enough smart bets, you have a chance to be a really good team and compete for a Super Bowl. And I think drafting a promising quarterback on day 2 who might have one thing wrong with them, or has a discount sticker on for one reason or another, it's just smart business.
What's the downside? The worst case scenario is that he's your backup quarterback for the rest of his rookie contract if you take him in the 4th round. What's the hit rate on 4th round picks at any position? So
Right.
I just think that again, the cost benefit is in your favor if you're going to approach it that way. There
And
are
it's not as hard to move away from him if it doesn't work out. Whereas with
there's
first
nothing
rounders,
preventing you from doing it.
exactly. First rounders, it feels like you get tied to those guys for 3 years. For Daniel Jones, like you feel like you have to stick with it and give him more patience. And it's just it's different when those guys aren't drafted in the first round. It gives you a little more freedom.
I want to look at your November big board and the top 100 that you just put out this
Okay.
week and just look at the biggest risers and fallers, guys who have the furthest separation, either in a good way or a bad way between those two rankings. There are a couple guys that stood out to me, but just off the top of your head, who in your mind changed the most in how you see them over the last 3-ish months?
Definitely Tyler Warren, the Penn State tight end. Ranking him
Top 10.
ranking him at 10, is basically an appreciation ranking for just a really good football player. There are teams around the league that say he's not going top 20 because he's a tight end. He's just so dang consistent, really strong through contact. He's going to test really well at 255 pounds. He is a factor. He's not just a possession guy. 56% of his yardage this year came after the catch. His dad was a safety at Richmond, and his nickname was the Hitman. So it's no mystery where Tyler got his competitiveness from. I
I
don't
love
think
these
he's
little
gonna.
nuggets that we're getting. These
Oh
little
yeah,
beast nuggets already. It's February 12th. They're just going to be sprinkling the breadcrumbs here for the
that's
next
it.
like month and a half.
Yeah, I don't think he's ultimately going to go top 10. Where I have him ranked, he's not Brock Bowers. He's not on that level. But it's almost similar to drafting a running back in the first round in that conversation, where if you feel like you are one piece away from elevating your offense, go make it happen. And like I think of Denver. It'd be such a great fit. You drop him in that offense, he's ready to go. I don't know if he's going to last that long, but I mean, Sean Payton's not afraid to move around on draft day, and so. But right after Tyler Warren, I had Colston Loveland, who the Michigan tight end. It's interesting because they're two different skill sets, and for most of this process, I have had Loveland ahead of Warren just because he's got a lot more upside, and I usually lean that way. But in this instance, I went with the more proven player. Loveland's basically a big wide receiver with speed, and I'll admit, I think there's a little recency bias baked into dropping him one spot below Warren because of how Dalton Kincaid has performed the last 2 years in Buffalo, where he is he's not going to give you a ton as a blocker, primarily a receiver, and that I believe Loveland is a first round pass catcher, can be a mismatch weapon, but I think it's fair to critique that style of tight end and how it might fit, especially with certain schemes and what they want out of their tight end.
It's interesting comparing the Dalton Kincaid draft to this draft when you look at the receivers available and the tight ends available, right? So you have Ted McMillan in your top 10, but you
Yeah,
don't have another pure wide receiver now until the 20s, right?
yeah,
Because of how far Luther Burden fell. So, and then you have two tight ends, they're top 15 picks. If you look back at the 2023 draft in some of your rankings, I'm sure Michael Mayer was higher than he was drafted.
yeah.
I'm sure Dalton Kincaid was higher than he was drafted. And we didn't see a receiver go off the board in that draft until 2020, right? Wasn't JSN the 20th
Jackson
overall
Smith,
pick?
yeah, yep.
Yeah, so
Jackson
it's
Smith, and then we had a
JSN,
run.
Zay, and then
Addison,
Quentin Johnston.
Nelson, yeah,
Yep, and then Jordan Addison. And so
yep.
comparing those two drafts, I think is telling here. You have these two tight ends that we think are better players potentially. And I think that's what the Bills told themselves is that we're
Mhm.
willing to wait out the receivers that went there and draft Dalton Kincaid because we actually thought Dalton Kincaid was the best pass catcher we could come out of this draft with. That ended up not being true. Like Zay Flowers is a very good football player, and
Yep.
JSN really broke out this year. But just in terms of the contours of the class positionally, this does feel a little bit from a pure outsider's perspective, like the 2023 draft felt a little bit.
No, and that's fair. And something that will a common theme in that draft. One of the reasons why I think we didn't, because Kincaid was the first tight end drafted, so we didn't have a tight end drafted in the top 25 that year. And I think one of the
Mayer was
reasons,
surprising, right? Like we thought Mayer would go higher than
yeah,
that, probably.
yeah. Well, I thought he would. I think I mocked him to like the Cowboys at 27 or 28. So
Yeah.
yeah, we thought he'd go first round. He just fell a couple picks into the second round. But a theme that year was it was a loaded tight end class. Where I mean, Tucker Kraft, I had him rated
Mhm.
really high. Shocked he fell as far as he did. Sam Laporta,
Musgrave,
yeah, Luke Musgrave. The Cowboys, they drafted the Michigan kid who has not worked out so far.
Schoonmaker.
Yes. So I think and that's similar this year, which might hurt a Tyler Warren, a Colston Loveland. This is a loaded tight end class. I think 5 in my top 64, 7 overall in the top 100. And so targeting a guy like Mason Taylor from LSU, Elijah Arroyo, Miami, Gunnar Helm, Texas, targeting one of those guys in round 2, I think is going to be a really appealing option for teams that are maybe looking at the tight end. Passing in the first round, maybe waiting till the second.
We're talking about who was going to go after those top 2 guys when you were looking at Carter and Travis Hunter. And for
Yeah.
a while, Will Johnson was in that conversation for you, the cornerback out of Michigan. And, he didn't fall precipitously in your latest top
Yeah.
100, but he went from the top 5 to now outside of the top 10. That was notable for me. Like, what had him drop a little bit for you based on how the back half of this season went?
Yeah, I think just being honest about the evaluation and seeing a really good player who's going to start in the league, but maybe not an elite player. And I think he was banged up most of this year, so it's not like out of sight, out of mind. Oh, he's going to drop. It wasn't necessarily that. It was more the questions about pure speed. Does he even run a 40-yard dash this spring? I would love for him to go out there, roll a 4.3 and prove me wrong. I'm not sure we're even going to see him run a 40-yard dash because I don't think he has that type of speed. And so if you don't have, it's very rare for a corner to go top 10 when you don't run a 4.44 or below. And I'm not sure that Will Johnson would be. I think he'd be more high 4.4s. And so I think that's the main hang up there. I still think he's a good player. I still think that he's, I would take him in the top 15 picks. But some of the pushback from teams on Will Johnson has been just the pure speed and questioning how that's going to hold up at the next level, especially because he will bite on double moves. Rome Odunze got him in a national title game last year. There were a couple times on this year's tape. I think it was actually the Washington tape this year where his misstep in coverage basically gave up the winning touchdown for the Huskies. So, it is something that is a little bit of a concern, just the pure speed, and not going to knock him out of the first round. That doesn't mean he's not a good player. It just means he's not a slam dunk top 5 guy.
2 Mizzou guys I wanted to hit. You had Luther Burden
Mhm.
higher on your last big board than you do on this one. Again, talking about that receiving group. What about how his season unfolded kind of pushed you toward that tweak?
What you love the most about him is with the ball in his hands and how he can create and basically becoming a running back after the catch. But is he a guy that you have to necessarily manufacture touches for, where you have to get him on those ISOs, where you have to get him across the field, where you can get a runway for him? Do you have to be a little more specialized with him? I think that's kind of the question mark with him. I mean, he could go top 12 and I wouldn't bat an eye because I get it. He's an explosive guy and he's not a smaller player. He's 210 pounds, good size athlete, and he can create. He can bring an explosive element to your offense. I'm not sold enough as him as a complete receiver to say, oh yeah, definitely, top 12, top 15 guy. But like I said, after I don't know, maybe after the top 12 guys between picks 13 and 40, you could really have a conversation about, should this be over him? Or it's not as obvious. I agonize over, okay, 18, 19, 20, cause you want to make sure you're getting these guys in the right neighborhood, but it's not these big gaps from player to player, as some people might think when you see a player at 20 compared to 12.
I was going to ask you, when does it flatten out a little bit?
Yeah.
And so in your mind, it's like 12 through 40-ish.
I mean, I think there's the top 2 guys are the top 2 guys, and then maybe 3 to 12, and then 13 to 45 around there. And then, I think it's fair to look at it in those terms where there's not a huge gap between these guys. There's a tier level where, and honestly, I think that's going to make for a really fun, when we're all together in a few months doing the draft Thursday night, we might have a few Cole Strange moments where it's, we didn't see
The
that
fact that you're
coming.
already fantasizing about this is why I just love you so much. You're already
Cannot
trying to put
wait.
yourself in a Cole Strange mindset 2 months from now.
Maybe something, playing around with my kids, but besides that, nothing gives me more joy than seeing a Cole Strange come off the board in the first round.
Good
Uh,
save.
Yeah. But this draft is going to set up where we can get a few of those moments because there is not huge gaps between these players among these tiers. And so, if Emeka Buka is a second receiver drafted or Matthew Golden from Texas, not a huge surprise because I can understand how a team might look at a specific skill set and say, yeah, that we want that over maybe what a Luther Burden offers. And so, there's not these big gaps between these players.
So you're saying, based on what we talked about at the beginning positionally and where the draft is, that if you were a team that, let's say hypothetically, had the 10th pick, the 39th pick, and the 41st pick, and you
Hypothetically.
needed defensive line help, that this would be a draft that sets up well for you?
That would be a fair thing to say. Purely hypothetically speaking.
Purely hypothetical. This is not set in
Yes.
reality.
No, but yes, that would make sense, and it speaks to this defensive line class. It is a loaded group, and so you're going to have options top 10, and then into the second round, whether you want edge rusher, you want interior defensive line help. I think the Bears are so interesting because at picking at 10, there's so many different directions they could go. While I think everybody thinks it's going to be somewhere in the trenches, right? It's going to be offensive line, it's going to be defensive line. And I think there's some really interesting options on both sides. What Armand Membu from Missouri, another
So I was about to
Missouri
ask you
guy.
about him because he
Yeah.
was not on your initial big board, correct?
No, when I did a top 50 back in November, he was not on it. He was honestly, I did not really study him until maybe Thanksgiving because he was a junior. I wasn't convinced he was coming out. Like it was just, you don't get to every underclassman until maybe November. And so Membu was one of those guys for me. And then once I got word that he was coming out, I watched him and I was blown away. I mean, I was okay. I immediately, usually I watch like 3 or 4 tapes on a guy and then take a break, watch a few more guys, and then maybe the next day come back to him and watch a few more tapes just to make sure what I'm seeing. With Membu, before I knew it, I was on his 8th tape. I was like, oh my God, okay, like this guy, I enjoy watching this guy play football. 20 years old, right tackle at Missouri, really coordinated in his movements, just exceptional body control. And one of the biggest, like Kelvin Banks, for example, from Texas, who a lot of people have him in the top 10. I've never had him in my top 10. I've never saw the top 10 with him. I think he's a fine player. I think he's a potential starter. He's a really solid player. There's just too much rough tape out there on him where he's losing balance. He's falling off blocks. I think he's probably a better guard, talking about Kelvin Banks. But I think you can go back and forth about whether moving him inside the guard is going to exacerbate those issues or help hide them. He's just a really interesting player. But I think when you watch Kelvin Banks and Membu back to back, I don't think there's any doubt who's the better player, and that's Membu. And again, just 20 years old, still learning. Some teams look at him at tackle, some think he's going to move inside the guard, but I think he's someone that the Bears would be pretty wise to consider him at 10.
Do you think he's somebody that could potentially play guard for a year and then move to tackle? Just
He played
hypothetically.
he played tackle in the SEC this year, and there was nothing on his tape that said he couldn't do it. He's long enough, he's got almost 34-inch arms. He's 6'4". I understand people wanting to move him inside the guard because I think he could do it, but there's nothing about his tape that says he can't play tackle. So yes, I think that he'd be a good candidate to come in and you could maybe work around him. He's again 20 years old, so there's going to be some young things you have. It's not like the Yale kid, where he's just so raw that it's going to take years before he's ready to give you legit snaps. Membu is ready to go out there. It's just there might be some bumps in the road that he's going to have to work through until you feel really comfortable with him, locking down a position.
Membu might be your answer to this, but who do you feel like in this initial top 100 you're ranking aggressively, either way below consensus or way above consensus?
Yeah, I mean, Membu and Kelvin Banks are, Membu's at 8, Kelvin Banks at 22. I think those two guys qualify. Jalen Walker at 3. We kind of talked on him about that a little bit, just how 3 to 12 is kind of they're closely ranked for me, and so you could really make an argument for different guys there at that third spot. And I don't think there's an obvious answer. Um, I think once you get to day 2 and even outside the top 50, a guy like Nick Scorton from Texas A&M, pass rusher. I mean, I still see people talking about him as a top 10 player, and I don't know. I don't see that at all. He's a good player, but I don't think he's not a lock to go in the top 40, top 50 picks. Just not how teams view him. He could, teams always need pass rush, but teams don't view him as that type of guy. We mentioned how it's a loaded running back class. I had 8 in my top 100. And I hated leaving off some guys like Devin Neal at Kansas, a few others, but a back who did make it, who's severely underrated, I think. Oregon's Jordan James. He's not a home run hitter, but he might lead the league in doubles. Consistently gets more than what's blocked for him. He's tough. He's quick. He finishes. I don't see a lot of love for him top 100, but he came in at 62 for me. So I think that's probably a little more aggressive than where most people look at him.
The David Montgomery sort of.
Sure.
Sort
Sure.
of.
I think of, watching him and Bucky Irving last year in the same backfield. And I don't know, I thought Jordan James was the better back. And so, they kind of offer some of the similar things. I mean, you look at what Bucky Irving meant for the Bucs this year. James can come in and give you the same type of impact.
Now that you've kind of started talking to more people in the league, or we're getting a little bit closer, and let's say the volume is being turned up on some of these conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like we're closer or further away from Jeanty going really, really high?
Honestly, it's so tough because this goes back to kind of the Bijan Robinson conversation, where it was so hard to do a mock draft with Bijan Robinson because there was not a clear place to put him. And then, like, even the Eagles, you're like, the Eagles make sense, but they're not going to draft a running back in the first round. And so it became tough. And so with Jeanty, it's kind of a similar thing in the top 20 picks where, the Cowboys, it kind of makes sense. It fits for a lot of different reasons. But is there any other team in the top 20 that you can maybe talk yourself into? And then I don't see a lot of landing spots. And so could we see a Denver trade up and get him, or a Washington to trade up and get him? Sure. I think that's definitely on the table. But as much as, and we mentioned with tight ends how being a loaded class might hurt the tight ends at the top. That could be true for running back as well. This is a loaded running back group, and that could affect, even though Jeanty is the top guy, it could affect how early teams are willing to draft a running back. So if the Cowboys don't draft him at 12, it's hard to find a landing spot in a top 20 pick. So I would lean towards Jeanty being talked about going later as opposed to earlier, just because it's hard to find those spots. Now, maybe over time, a team like the Falcons with Bijan, that will present itself. Who knows? I mean, we didn't see Jahmyr Gibbs coming in terms of where he landed. I no problem with him going top 20. I praised that pick when it happened, but no one saw the Lions doing that. So, could we see a shocker like that again with Jeanty? Yeah, I mean, you can't rule that out.
It's interesting looking at like the teams in the top 10-ish, where it's like, all right, Carolina's already spent on running back. They drafted, I mean, obviously Brooks got hurt, but they've already spent a lot on that position. The Bears, like, people are going to do that. People already have. Like, you need to eat your vegetables first before we're allowed to have dessert. Like, that's where I am with the Bears and Jeanty. Like, when you need 3 or 4 starters on your 2 lines, you're not allowed to draft a running back in the top 10. It's unacceptable.
What about the Raiders?
So that's the other one where I think, but they just have enough holes, and they're starting not from square one, but they're starting far enough behind the 8 ball where it's like, can you really justify this? Like, I like some of the pieces they have along the offensive line. I actually think that group with Chip Kelly, the running game is going to be pretty interesting to me pretty quickly as I sit and think about it. But with how many things you probably need along the defensive, I don't know. I think they still just need enough high impact pieces where it's hard to justify that sort of move.
But I think that is one spot where it wouldn't be a complete shock if they did it, where you can, a new regime coming in, you make a splashy draft pick like this, who could be you don't know what quarterback what the quarterback position is going to look like. So let's add an impact running back who's going to help open things up for whoever's at quarterback. Pete Carroll, the way he looks at, the run game's obviously important to him and what he wants the offense to look like. So I don't think it's a likely thing to happen, but I at least would not be completely shocked, even though I agree with you. The smarter way of attacking it would be to build up the roster and address the position later. But yeah, I mean, just looking through the teams, it's like I said, besides Dallas, there aren't a lot of like Arizona made sense, but they just re-upped James Conner, so I don't see that. And they drafted Benson in the day 2 last
Yeah.
year. The Bengals are interesting because I think Chase Brown had a pretty good year, but I don't think they're necessarily tied to the hip with him. But they have so many other need areas that would they really
If the
draft a running
Bengals draft
back?
a running back with the 17th overall pick, given the current state of their defense and the holes they have
That's
along the offensive line, then we need to run people out of town.
But that's exactly it. All the needs elsewhere makes it just so hard to draft a running. But there will be a point where a team says, "All right, you know what? Screw it. We can't let him fall another spot." And that's why I think a team like Washington would make sense if you would make it that far. But I think they'd have to trade up to go get him because I just don't see him falling that far. But yeah, Jeanty will be a wild card in this first round. There's no doubt about it.
The Denver thing we keep coming back to, that to me
Yeah.
is fun. I think a tight end and a running back for Denver is just, it's so apparent what that would do for their offense is currently constructed. The fact that offensive line is intact. But you look at the Raiders and the Raiders are, I think, the only team in the top 10 as it currently stands, where maybe Carolina too, but I think I want to say Austin Corbett is a free agent after this season. So, but if you look at the Raiders right now, of all the teams in the top 10, they might be the only team where you could say, we know that their starting offensive line at the end of last year, they can roll into 2025 with that group, and you could justify it. I don't think you can really say that about any of the other teams in the top 10. So if we're trying to find a path for how a team talks themselves into Ashton Jeanty, I think the Raiders are probably the most likely team in the top 10, even if I think it's probably a little bit aggressive given some of the other needs that they still have.
Well, and it's interesting with Chip Kelly now in the fold. There are 2 Ohio State running backs that are going to go top 75 in this draft. And so do they target one of those guys because, proof's in the pudding. They know, and obviously Chip will have no better idea of who those running backs are as impact players. So that's just an interesting wrinkle when you have a college OC like Chip Kelly go into a pro team. Not that what he says is going to determine the draft pick, but he has such a unique understanding of, because Ohio State's they probably, because they had a few guys go back, they probably don't set the record for draft picks, but I think they're going to tie it at 15. And so it's just a unique situation when you have a guy like Chip Kelly who knows a lot of those offensive guys intimately about their strengths, weaknesses, who they are as people, and how will we see that factor into what the Raiders do on draft weekend.
Any other thoughts about your initial top 100 that we have not gotten to that you want to get across to people as they're combing through it?
No, I would say, this is going to fluctuate. It will. And Jalen Walker at 3, I understand is aggressive. And I think the combine is going to be big for him because so much of his evaluation is its projection. For Georgia last year, he was all over the front 7, mostly as an off-ball player. So he made plays in different ways, but by far he was most impressive as an edge rusher. So that's where I have him, as an edge rusher, and the combine will be important to show that. He's listed at, I think, 6'2", 245. He plays really long, but coming in with 33 and a half, 34-inch arms, that'll be important just to make sure we're cementing what we see on tape. What's his 10-yard split? How does he move in space? I think we know the answer to all those questions, but just seeing it at the combine helps reinforce what you're seeing on tape. And if he doesn't, then it's okay. Let's go back and figure it out, because he could probably be an off-ball linebacker and develop. He needs more development, but I think he could do it at the NFL level. But I think his strength is getting after the quarterback. So that's where I have him. And does a lot of freaky things. And so that's why he's at 3, but it's a projection. And there's a couple of those guys in this draft where you have to maybe fudge a little bit about what they're going to be at the next level. And Jalen Walker is the best example of that, which isn't ideal when you're talking about drafting a player top 5, top 10, but just one of those years. And, Jalen Walker is going to be one of the more fascinating players that teams might be a little bit split on as we get closer to draft weekend.
Micah Parsons fell out of the top 10. Little things like that, we forget when we talk about guys that maybe they blur the lines a little bit in what they do best, but you draft a freaky athlete on defense and you figure it out later. There are some risks with that. There are also some rewards waiting at the end of that process.
Especially in this draft, in this class.
Yes.
Yeah.
When there's no clear-cut guys outside of the top 2 where you're like, that guy's a day one difference maker. I already see what it is. If you're having to tell yourself a story about everybody, you might as well tell yourself a story about the guy who is uber talented.
It's betting on upside. I love Mason Graham, defensive tackle, Michigan. He's my number 4 player. Love Mason Graham. I don't think he's anything close to Quinnen Williams. He's not that type of defensive tackle. And so if you want to bet on upside, I totally understand that with a guy like a Jalen Walker or, maybe one of the biggest, maybe, in terms of just freakiness is Shamar Stewart from Texas A&M. He's 285 pounds. But, the sack production, he had 4.5 career sacks. But it's interesting because when you look at the pressures, he actually led Texas A&M in pressures. I think 39 pressures, but only 1.5 sacks. So he would get there. He just couldn't finish. And so a guy that is that freaky, who at 285 pounds is explosive off the ball, can corner, he can flatten, he can win with power. It's just he needs continue to be coached up. I think it'll be easy for teams to talk themselves into the traits of Shamar Stewart, and he's going to be one of the more interesting evaluations about how early he goes because just how unique his profile is. So he's definitely one we'll be talking about more throughout the process.
Talking about Jalen Walker at the Combine, it's a good thing to mention because that is the next time we will be chatting with you. We will be doing a Combine preview here in about, what day is it, Beller? I have no idea where I am or what day it is. A Combine preview in about a week and a half, I think is the answer to that, heading into that week in Indy. I'm very excited about that. I am very excited for Brugler season, which that's what the draft is now. And I'm looking forward to seeing you when we get to Indianapolis. It is a fun stretch of the calendar, and I'm happy that we're leaning back into it.
No, I can't wait, man.
All right, guys, that's all we've got for today. We have one more show coming your way this week. We've done this every year, the week after the Super Bowl. I always like doing it as sort of a table setter for what February and March are going to feel like. Me and Derek are just going to ask the biggest questions we have about this NFL offseason. What are the biggest dominoes? What are the free agent names worth paying attention to? What are some of the quarterback movement questions that we want to ask? So we're going to be doing that on Friday. A reminder, I'm saying weekly-ish because there are going to be exceptions to this. For example, when we're at the Combine, we're going to be doing a show every week, so there will be no mailbag. The first week of free agency, we're going to be doing a show every day, so there's not going to be a mailbag. But for the most part, we're going to have a weekly mailbag every single week during the offseason. I love doing them. I miss doing them. The last one we did a couple weeks ago was my favorite show we did in a while. So I need you guys to help me with that. The reason we do these things is because you guys ask such good questions and you make them worthwhile. So please send along your questions. Because we're going to be doing them so consistently, there's not really a deadline on this. Just keep sending in your questions and thoughts, and I will be consistently combing through it over the course of the offseason. athleticfootballshow@gmail.com, whether it's a rant about your favorite team, whether you're having an existential crisis about your favorite team, whether you have a specific question about your favorite team or something that's going to come this offseason, just unload it in the email, and I will take a look at it, and we will hopefully fold it into the show. So just a reminder that I'm going to be prodding you guys with over the course of this entire offseason. For now, that is all we've got. Sincerely appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk to you very soon.